Ordinarily, it would be David Levy's job to do this, but because he thought he would be away, I agreed to do it, and now I shall go ahead, even though it would be better, no doubt, if David were to do it, because among other things, he would, I expect, do it more briefly. This is the 12th in a series of lectures devoted annually to issues in intellectual property and entertainment. The lecture was endowed by Kip Frey, who graduated from the law school in the class of '85, and his wife Meredith, whom we warmly thank for their generosity. I am, in fact, delighted to introduce today's lecturer, Cary Sherman, who is chairman and CEO of the Recording Industry Association of America, or the RIAA, as my friends in the music business in Nashville insist on calling it, and maybe called by everyone, Cary. Those who know Cary will agree that Cary is the epitome of the lawyer as counselor and advocate and executive. I've known him myself for more than 30 years, in the course of which I've come to think of him as among the most knowledgeable, influential, personally elegant, and intellectually formidable figures in the entertainment and copyright fields. And he did not arrive at this pinnacle by accident. Graduate of Harvard Law, Cary spent 26 years at Arnold & Porter in Washington, D.C., where he became head of that firm's intellectual property and technology practice. He left the firm in 1997 to join the RIAA as general counsel and subsequently moved into the presidency. In 2011, he succeeded Mitch Boulware as chairman and CEO of the RIAA. Now, as I imagine most of us here know, Cary's years in the music business have coincided with a remarkable array of challenges to the industry. The advent of the digital technologies and the internet that confronted musicians and their representatives have done so with issues that are at least equal in difficulty to any their predecessors have ever faced, and arguably are even greater, which I think is saying something. From its inception, the music business in America, in its several parts, and especially the recording industry, have had to work and sometimes fight hard for their successes, on behalf not merely of themselves and the businesses which they represent, but more important even than that, for the artists whom they represent. I happen to have been reading Clive Davis's recent and really quite excellent memoir about his own time in the business, a memoir entitled My Life, the Soundtrack of My Life, which begins roughly where Davis's own career began in the mid-1960s, when he signed his first major recording artist, Janis Joplin, for Columbia Records. And even then, more than half a century of battles for survival had preceded his own colorful entry upon the stage. So it is neither remarkable nor wrong to think of Cary Sherman as the successor to a long and luminous parade of major figures in one of our most important areas of artistic endeavor in the cultural life of America. Cary has proven himself equal to the role, and I have no doubt will go on doing so for as long as he wants. And we are fortunate indeed to be gathered here today as he shares with us his own views about what lies ahead for the music industry in our time. Let us welcome Cary Sherman.
Thank you, David. David is always such an eloquent speaker and is nothing better than when he speaks eloquently about you. So thank you very much. That was very nice. Thanks for having me here today. I assume that many of you know RIAA. It's probably pretty well known on college campuses, at least judging by the sales of toilet paper. A lot of people think our image is crappy, but, you know, we deal with it. We don't even know whether this is two-ply, but we're still trying to figure out how to get royalties on it. I can assure you that a lot of the stuff that you read about us online is simply not true. There's no truth to this story. This also is not true. Our lawyers did not catch Osama bin Laden. But this one does happen to be true. We have a large storage shed of kittens in the back. It was very nice to be invited to give the Frey lecture on intellectual property, and I suppose we could talk about it in terms of copyright law and all sorts of other academic disciplines. Okay. But that better? Can you hear me? Okay. I think that the real focus really ought to be here on the real world rather than the academic doctrines, because I can't think of any better example of what is happening in the real world and the impact of intellectual property than the fate of the music industry. We have been, after all, the veritable canary in the coal mine, the test case, the poster child for what happens when the internet confronts traditional old media and the disruption that occurs. I wanted to therefore talk about what has happened, and I'm pleased to tell you that the story is moving towards a happy ending. We have really transformed how we do business, and I'd like to share with you 5 big picture facts that you should know about the modern music business. The first is that we're now primarily digital. CDs are no longer our primary source of revenue. Digital is not just our future, it is our present. And by the way, these are 2011 figures. The 2012 figures haven't come out yet, but you can expect further growth in that as well. In 2004, the first year we had real digital revenues, we had about $190 million from digital services. In 2011, it was nearly $3.5 billion. That's quite a change. And again, you won't be surprised to learn that the 2012 numbers will be even higher. And by the way, the music industry is way ahead of our sister industries transitioning to digital, as you can see from that chart. There's a lot of pain in store for a lot of businesses on the way. Hopefully, we will be a good model for the way forward. We used to hear that we needed to get a new business model. Well, our companies have done just that. You want DRM-free downloads? We've got that in spades. And by the way, I want to emphasize DRM-free because I have been amazed at how many people still think that all the downloads are in some proprietary format that you can't transfer to different devices and that everything is locked down. That just isn't the case. If you'd like to pay a small monthly fee for a subscription to unlimited music on your computer or your smartphone, we've got that too. You want free ad-supported streaming, we've got that. You want a music service that's bundled with your mobile phone, we've got that. You want to store all your music in the cloud so you can access it from anywhere, we've got that. You want specialized digital radio services, there are lots available and more on the way. You want AM/FM radio stations online, that's available too. All of these business models have been embraced and licensed by the major music companies, and in fact, there are over 500 digital services authorized by our member companies worldwide, offering 30 million authorized tracks. And by the way, this isn't an industry that has traditionally relied on windowing of its releases. So if you have problems seeing Game of Thrones or something, that is not us. We really have all our music available on these services. And the good news is that collectively, all of these legal services consumers like a lot. In nearly every major country, including the United States, an overwhelming majority of users are very happy with their experience. And it's our job to not only keep them happy, but to make them even happier as our business models and offerings continue to evolve. Okay, a second point. It's something I think you should know more because I find it interesting and also because it's counterintuitive. You probably know that historically, a very small percentage of albums accounted for the vast majority of sales. That was true for many decades. But what you may not know is that it remains true today. In 2011, 2% of the new releases accounted for 89% of sales. Clearly, the internet has created untold opportunities for the ability to distribute music easily and cheaply. In fact, in 2011, there were some 77,000 albums produced, but most of them barely sold at all. 80% sold less than 100 copies. I think that's an astounding number. 80% less than 100 copies. 94% sold less than 1,000. So for all the opportunities for niche, specialized genres of music to find their fans and so on, for all the deep catalog made available online, for all of the predictions about the impact of the long tail, what's most downloaded is the most popular stuff. And by the way, this is not just true of downloads, it's true of streaming services too, because streaming services tend to basically mirror the sales charts. So what does this tell us about labels? It's a new world. It's easier to produce music. You can do it in your bedroom with really high quality equipment. Anybody can be an artist, create music, and post it online. So it raises a very reasonable question. Do artists need a business partner to help promote, produce, and market music in the digital age? And I think the answer is yes. Breaking through in a cluttered online landscape with lots of competition for attention is incredibly hard to do without a business partner. These are people who are creators. They make music. They don't necessarily know how to market it or how to make money from it as a business. And when there is so much music available, the role of a label just as a curator of talent becomes all that much more important. And that makes sense because music labels are to artists what venture capital companies are to tech startups. They decide which are the most promising. They decide in whom to invest their money and their human resources to give them an opportunity to make a go of it. We invest billions of dollars in A&R, which is the bread and butter of what a label does. A quarter of the artists on our labels are new artists. And that investment, the investment that we're making percentage-wise, surpasses what a host of other industries spend on R&D. And by the way, putting out records is not cheap. It can cost north of $1 million to introduce a new artist. It's a very high-risk venture. More often than not, it will not produce a return. Labels remain the primary investors in artists, and that's why, to this day, 70% of unsigned artists want a record deal. Certainly, artists are able to attain success on their own. We welcome that. We welcome the fact that there's a marketplace where you can do it without the help of some record label or any other intermediary. But labels do matter. They not only hone the talent of emerging artists, they also market and promote and create demand for the music. And judging by the data I've shown you, I think that record labels, whether they're majors or they're indies, are doing a great job at what they do. All right, third, you all know that we've complained loudly about the illegal downloading of music, so let me just make a few points about it. As a business, we're about half the size we used to be. We were nearly a $15 billion business in 1999. We're down to about $7 billion in 2011. Is that decline entirely due to illegal downloading? I doubt it. There are a lot of factors at play, including marketplace developments like selling individual tracks instead of entire albums. Is every illegal download a lost sale? Of course not. But nearly every academic study and nearly every economist, not to mention common sense, has concluded that illegal downloading has hurt us. We can argue over how much harm, but the fact of harm really can't be disputed. There are fewer artists on our rosters, less money to invest in artists, and massive layoffs. There are a lot of studies, by the way. And yes, it is of course true that file sharing services can be used for perfectly legitimate purposes. But let's also be honest about it. The overwhelming majority are using it to infringe. There was a study of BitTorrent by Envisional in 2011 that looked at the top 10,000 torrents. About 36% were porn. No surprise there. 64% were copyrighted works. Identified works that were not copyrighted, 1/100 of 1%. There was a similar study by Professor Ed Felton of Princeton. He concluded that about 1% of a sample of BitTorrent files were likely non-infringing. So it's not surprising that our sales would be down. But probably the most important fact, but one that doesn't seem to really be known by many people, is that fewer people today are trying to make it as musicians than before, trying to make a living from music. According to BLS data from the federal government, the number of people who identify themselves as musicians has declined over the last decade. Between August 1999 and August 2012, there was a decline of 33% in people working as musicians. And you can see how the trend line conspicuously tracks the decline of the industry. So obviously, piracy is not just a problem for our economy, it's a problem for our culture. And that's why professional musicians care about piracy. They care about it not just because of its impact on their own incomes, but also because of its impact on new artists, on the ability of amateurs to become professionals, and on music itself. You've just read the Eminem thing. This is just a sampling of the public statements that artists have been making over the years that was compiled by David Lowery, who runs a blog called The Tricordist, which I highly recommend. From a creator's perspective, there's no better summary of the views of artists. When it comes to protecting or enforcing creative rights, the effort is often caricatured. It's silly, it's a waste of time, it's a game of whack-a-mole, it's trying to put the genie back in the bottle, it can't possibly make a difference. And I completely understand that skepticism. We've asked ourselves over the years, does this really make an impact? But there is actually fresh evidence emerging that strategic copyright protection really can make a difference in terms of deterring would-be illegal downloaders and putting money into the pockets of artists and labels and their publishers. So you're all familiar with LimeWire. Between 2007 and 2010, about 2/3 of file sharers used LimeWire. A federal court finally shut them down for inducing massive copyright infringement at the end of October 2010. The very next month after LimeWire was shut down, digital sales improved, and they've remained higher ever since. That is not a coincidence. 2 market research firms have released surveys showing that the number of P2P users dropped significantly, and more than half the people who had used LimeWire did not go to another illegal music site to get their music after the shutdown. In other words, this was an example of moving people from illegal to legal consumption. The same conclusion emerged from an academic study on the impact of Hadopi in France. I don't know if you're familiar with Hadopi, but the French government actually passed a law in which, it's a graduated response program, in which illegal file sharers get a notice, and after a few notices, they can actually have a fine imposed on them by a government authority or have their service terminated. Well, a couple of professors, Brett Danaher from Wellesley and Michael Smith from Carnegie Mellon, undertook a very interesting economic analysis of the impact of that law. And they found that the mere enactment of the law and all the attendant publicity about it had a very significant impact. iTunes album sales increased by 25% just from the enactment of the law. New Zealand recently also put into place a graduated response program, and there, too, the mere enactment reduced the amount of P2P file sharing. Consider the impact of one of the most important enforcement actions of all, which is the criminal indictment of Mega Upload. I assume you've all heard of Kim.com, a truly larger-than-life figure, and his notoriously profitable cyberlocker service called Mega Upload, which specialized basically in the massive distribution of copyrighted content illegally. It would not be big news that Kim.com was sued. What is big news is that he was indicted. Now, cyber locker services are like other rogue pirate sites that engage in this kind of business. They will do it for the money for as long as they possibly can. They understand that being sued is part of the process. Lawsuits take a long time. It took us 4 years to get a decision in the LimeWire case. And then that was on summary judgment. That should give you an idea that there were no facts in dispute. It took 4 years for us to get a judgment in LimeWire. All that time, they just kept operating and make millions and millions of dollars every year that they stash away, hide away so that you can never get access to it. And then when they have to shut down, they shut down. But when you're indicted, when you're facing a prison term, it tends to focus the mind. It tends to make you think a little bit differently about the risks that you're taking. And that's what the Mega Upload indictment did. It focused the minds of all the other locker services that were engaged in the same kind of infringing behavior. And of the top 8 rogue services, 7 either closed down, disabled sharing, or introduced filtering, dramatically eliminating or reducing infringement on their services. That's what we call strategic enforcement. And look at the marketplace impact of these changes. The global audience for illicit lockers declined significantly in the 6-month period following the indictment. Now, in the end, we go back to the core principle that the single most important mechanism for working anti-piracy is innovation, experimenting and offering new business models with our technology partners on consumer-friendly terms that really make people want to go to legitimate services, giving consumers what they want. But we also have come to the conclusion that enforcing rights is a necessary complementary strategy. In fact, just this past week, NPD released a survey it had done that supports that conclusion. They found that P2P usage fell by nearly 20% in 2012, and they attributed it to the growth of streaming services and the shutdown of illegal sites like LimeWire. The good news is that between the new business models and strategic enforcement, the lines have crossed. Illegal downloading is on the decline, while use of legal music services has steadily increased, and now we hope that those trends continue. Okay, the music business continues to evolve, and therefore so must our priorities. So let me try and break down what we're doing to 4 key goals nowadays. One of our highest priorities is to simplify licensing and develop the infrastructure that will make it faster and easier to offer even more innovative business models and to distribute royalties more quickly and efficiently. We're working on new industry-wide databases so that the royalty distribution system can function more efficiently and effectively. We're in the process of negotiating reforms for the licensing of musical works, which is a very complicated area, but we're trying to get that simplified as well. Last year, we announced, along with music publishers and a large number of digital music services, really a groundbreaking licensing agreement that will make it easier for digital services to clear rights for new models. We came up with a series of models so that the publishing rates could be predetermined so that entrepreneurs will be able to know in advance what the costs will be for publishers and songwriters so that it will be even easier for them to offer innovative services to music fans. The good news for us is that the existing marketplace is already impressive. We want to be an evangelist for that new marketplace to help it make it easier for consumers to basically know what's out there, to navigate these new services, to understand the sheer range and breadth of what's now available. And one way that we're doing that is a site called whymusicmatters.com. We sought to create a one-stop shop, an informational website for where to find music, whether it's physical discs or the top sites and services offering digital music in all sorts of forms and formats. It's a very consumer-friendly site that has gotten very good reviews. People really like the information it provides. And it also happens to include some incredible videos featuring Jay-Z and Florence and the Machine and Robert Johnson and Kate Bush and a bunch of others. So you really should check it out and just play with it. The music business is changing. Our priorities are changing. So is the approach to dealing with illegal downloading. And it is encouraging to us that so many would-be partners in the internet ecosystem, ISPs, credit card companies, advertisers, search engines, are increasingly recognize that they too have a role to play in building an internet that's safe, that's secure, that works for everyone, including the creative community. So we have spent a lot of time now focusing on forging voluntary marketplace agreements. First, we have a voluntary program with ISPs to address illegal downloads on P2Ps. You may have heard about this because it just launched last week. And for those of you who may not know about it, very briefly, it's a deal that we did with 5 ISPs, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Time Warner, and Cablevision. It covers music and movies. It's completely voluntary. It creates a new entity called CCI to oversee the program, to assure that the technologies that are used for detection and for linking a particular subscriber account to an infringement are validated, to set up a process for independent review when there's a challenge to the accuracy of an allegation, to provide education to the public. And the program is primarily educational. The information is not given to the content owner. Just the information about an infringement occurring at a particular IP address is forwarded to the ISP. The ISP links it to a subscriber and sends an alert to them, letting them know that their account may be being used for illegal purposes. But the information about who that subscriber is never given to anybody. So after a series of notices, basically education with acknowledgement, After the 5th notice at that point, the ISP can apply a mitigation measure, which could be slowing bandwidth speeds for a couple of days, or saying you have to do an educational online copyright tour before you can get out to the internet. It's up to the ISP to determine what to do. But it's an example of a voluntary collaboration that is primarily educational, trying to switch people over from casual infringement to part of the legitimate music industry. We also helped craft an agreement with major credit card companies on voluntary best practices to reduce sales of counterfeit and pirated goods. A few months ago, major advertisers and ad agencies announced a series of voluntary best practices so that their valuable brands would not be associated with rogue websites. They don't want to have their brands tarnished by that connection, and they also don't want to inadvertently enrich rogue website operators by paying them advertising money. Now we're in discussions with ad networks to try and extend that relationship. We're also working on similar deals with registries and registrars so that bad actors who repeatedly and deliberately violate the terms of service for domain names can be sanctioned. And of course, we're dealing with search engines. That's one of the toughest nuts to crack. But we've made some progress. In the last couple of years, Google has made it easier for us to request removal from their search engine of infringing links. Believe it or not, it was until 2007 that Google required us to notify them of removal requests by fax. They wouldn't even let us use email. In 2007, they let us use email. Now we have a tool that we can use so we can submit requests in bulk, and they've improved their takedown times from about 7 days to a few hours. So we're making some progress. But a very persistent problem has been search engines pointing users to illegal links to illegal copies of copyrighted content. If you enter Rihanna and MP3, you'll probably get 6, 7, or maybe 8 illegal sites on the first page of 10 results. That's obviously a problem for us. We've been complaining about it for a long time, and about 6 months ago, Google actually announced that it would take into account all of the removal requests they're receiving in their ranking algorithm, so that rogue sites that have generated large numbers of removal requests would appear lower in the search results. We thought this was a great idea. The use of data, which is what Google is all about, very data-driven company, using data to basically de-rank the bad guys and improve the ranking of the legitimate services. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much of an impact from this program yet, and that was a point we made in an analysis we issued a couple of weeks ago. We put out a report card which said we found no evidence that Google's policy had demonstrated an impact on demoting pirate sites. In fact, pirate sites that, according to Google's transparency report, they now publish all the data on how many notices they receive, not just from us, but from every kind of content owner in every different industry. It's all available on Google. And their transparency report, basically, if you look at all the sites that had received more than 100,000 notices, 100,000 takedown requests, those sites still appeared on the first page of search results 80 to 90% of the time. Legitimate sites were lucky if they appeared 50% of the time. But we continue to work with Google to get to a better place, and we remain optimistic. The fact is, these programs are not going to be a panacea. No program ever will be. But collectively, you add up all of these collaborative efforts, and we think that they can make a difference. They're the product of a lot of outreach over a long period of years. It took us 3 years to negotiate the ISP deal alone. So we're talking not only with a wide range of intermediaries, but also civil society groups, groups that really want to figure out how to address online problems like piracy or anything else while ensuring the preservation of a free and open internet. We need to engage in the same sort of outreach directly with the tech community, and we're committed to doing that. We are doing that because in the end, we think everybody has an interest in an internet that's open and free, but not lawless. Okay, so I've talked about these new business models that the music business is embracing, a lot of which are access models. These access models are probably our future, or certainly a very important part of our future, and protecting that future, protecting these new revenue streams is a very key priority. A few years ago, they were insignificant revenues. Today, revenues from these models grew nearly 60% in 2012, and they represent nearly $500 million. A few years ago, access models generally represented a fraction of overall industry revenues. Today, they're 8% of the market. And if you fast forward 5 years from now, we're thinking 25% or even more of the music business. So this is not just an important component of our present, it's an essential aspect of our future. We have to earn a fair market return for the music that is the foundation of these access model businesses. But as you may have heard, Pandora has different plans. I should mention that I'm a big fan of Pandora and the service they've built, but I am not a big fan of the way they ran to Congress to get legislation to change the standard by which their rates are determined so that they can pay less to artists and labels. At their prodding, legislation was introduced called the Internet Radio Fairness Act. And that sounds innocuous enough, as all legislation is designed to do, but it's anything but. The impact on the music community, both artists and labels, who split this revenue stream evenly, by the way, it's 50-50, would be profound. An estimated 85% reduction in the royalty payments and a cascading effect on other royalty deals. The bill would simply decimate the revenue stream and be a crippling blow to musicians. And for who? Pandora, is no longer the bootstrap startup. It's a $1.5 billion Wall Street company, publicly traded, with executives who have taken millions of dollars from the company. and that's great for them. They've got booming revenue. They've got incredible user growth. Frankly, it's the envy of any technology company. We congratulate them. But why shouldn't they be able to make a successful business out of all these users and out of all this revenue? How is it that they want us to further subsidize their business so that they can make more money? And frankly, it's not just unfair, it's just bad policy. If the government is going to require, as it does, the government requires us to license our music to webcasters like Pandora on demand for them. If they want it, they've got it. Don't you think that the royalty rates should at least reflect the fair market value of the music? Is there some government policy where music should be valued less than other goods and services that people create? The rate standard that's proposed in IRFA protects incumbents against disruption. I find this particularly odd. Pandora is an internet company. Internet companies have the view that disruption is one of the best things that can happen to a market. It will increase consumer welfare. They love disruption. And here we have Pandora proposing a rate standard that is intended to minimize disruption to industry. Pandora argues that it should get the same rate standard as its competitors. But what they don't tell you is that only 3 companies operate under the rate standard that they would like to be on. It's an old rate standard that Congress grandfathered back in 1998 when it created a new rate standard called willing buyer, willing seller, basically a marketplace standard. There are now 2,000 companies operating under the willing buyer, willing seller standard. So if you want everyone to operate under the same standard, and we think that's the right thing to do, then bring the 3 grandfathered companies who no longer need it anyway, bring them up to the same fair market value standard that the other 2,000 companies are paying on right now. You don't force a race to the bottom. You put everybody on a fair market value standard. And lastly, how can you actually think that you're creating a level playing field when the bill doesn't address the most outrageous inequity of all, and that's the special interest exemption for terrestrial broadcasters? I don't know how much you know about this, but basically AM/FM radio, they pay songwriters and publishers. They pay nothing to labels and artists. 0, nothing. They've never paid, and if they have their way, they never will. So artists and labels receive nothing, even though radio stations have built their business on the back of the music that they play. So you want a level playing field for all platforms? Get broadcasters to pay their fair share. All those reasons and a whole lot more, which I haven't bothered going into, 130 leading artists across all genres of music signed an open advertisement, a letter, decrying this Pandora bailout bill. Common, the Dead Kennedys, The Game, Katy Perry, Rihanna, Roger Waters, Zac Brown Band, Neo, Janelle Monáe. It was really a who's who of major artists, indie artists, new artists, legacy artists, all coming together to protect what they consider is the future of music. And this battle is just beginning, because Pandora has made clear that it will be back in Congress pressing for legislation again this year. And we, and the artist community, and the managers, and the songwriters, and publishers, and producers, and major labels, and indie labels, and everyone else who earns a living from this business will be back there too, because protecting this stream of revenue from these new access models means protecting the future of music. Okay, last one, we've talked about the various digital music services, we've talked about the music business, education, enforcement, but ultimately it really is all about music, and more music is being consumed than ever, and music matters more than ever. 19 of the 20 most watched videos of all time on YouTube are music videos. 7 of the top 10 followed Twitter accounts are artists. 9 of the top 10 celebrities on Facebook are artists. Music is an important driver of smartphone sales and a key part of the smartphone experience. In fact, we're getting to a point now where devices are being advertised not for what the device is, the technology of the device, but for the content it can deliver. Across the world, music is the most popular subject of discussion on social networks. It dominates more discussion than even sports and politics. That may be true of everywhere except Duke, but seems to be true generally. Music remains a centrifugal force in our culture and in commerce, and it's only going to get stronger. And that's one of the reasons that we're very optimistic about the future. Music will always be in demand. Getting to this point where we can feel optimism again has been long and hard. But revenues are stabilizing, new models are gaining traction, new revenue streams are growing, piracy is declining, venture capital investment is increasing, and music is more popular than ever and helping fuel the digital economy. So in the end, it's all about music. It's worth creating, it's worth protecting, and we're going to do our part to work hard to make it available in new and better ways for the future. Thanks. I hope I've left time for questions. Are you going? Sure, of course. Sure.
So Pandora, though it does have these things going for it that you mentioned, it has been unable to turn a profit in its existence thus far. And their argument is that without a change in the way their royalty rates are calculated, they're going to have to disappear. The company will not be able to survive. Is that factoring into the RIAA's analysis of what they want to do with Pandora? Or?
Of course it would factor into our analysis. We just disagree with what they say. Number one, they haven't said that they will disappear because they can't afford to pay these rates. They've said the opposite. They've said, we're fine. We can do fine. We're just looking for what's fair. And why did they say that? Because in 2011, they got a whole lot of people to invest in the company, and they didn't say anything about having any problem with a rate structure that would prevent them from turning a profit. So they have to be very, very careful about what they say when it comes to worrying about the future. Second, we actually think that they're doing just fine when it comes to advertising revenues. They just haven't made much of an effort to monetize. We did a deal with them in 2009 where back in 2007, they made the argument very specifically to all their users that they could go out of business if the royalty rates that were set by the government were not brought down. They said that the royalty rates were too high, they simply couldn't sustain the business. So we negotiated a separate deal with them, which was codified in legislation in 2009. And we gave them a steep discount on the rates, and in exchange, we got a 25%, a greater of 25% of revenues. And the theory of it was that they were going to sell so much advertising because they're so good at targeting their demographics by zip code, by demographic information, and so on and so forth, that they were going to be able to earn a great deal of money from advertising, and therefore we'd be paid on the higher rate of 25% of revenues. Well, they didn't do that. They said they were going to, but instead they pursued what I would call an IPO business strategy. Give the music away for free with barely any advertising at all, so you're earning very little in the way of revenues, but you're attracting a lot of eyeballs because there's none of that advertising interfering with the user experience, to the point where they get 200 million people to sign up for the service, and then they go to Wall Street and cash in an IPO. Great, more power to them. They raised $235 million. They've made a lot of money for the founders and so on and so forth. Great. But then don't turn around and say, oh, wait a minute, now we've got shareholders and we have to monetize more effectively, and the easiest way to do that is just to reduce our costs. The way that they should do it is increase their revenues, not reduce their costs. Sirius XM, who they complain about is paying less than them, Sirius XM monetizes really well. They're making money hand over fist. SiriusXM is supposedly paying 8% compared to Pandora's 50 to 60%, but SiriusXM pays us 2 to 3 times more per user in royalties than Pandora does. Can they monetize more effectively? I have no doubt. They're running 2, 3, or 4 ads an hour. Their radio competition, and they consider themselves competitors with terrestrial radio, are running 25 ads an hour. I think that there's a little room for them to sell a little more advertising and yet not turn off listeners. And what about getting people to upgrade to the subscription service that they're supposed to? What about charging for the app that was the #1 and then the #2 most popular app on the iPhone? Could have charged 99 cents for it. They didn't charge anything because they wanted the IPO strategy. We frankly are quite bullish on Pandora's future. If you looked at the charts in terms of the revenue growth and the user base growth, and you look at the fact that local advertising is where they're going to make their money in the future, and they're finally beginning to hire people in the major markets to sell local advertising. And just a day or two ago, it was announced that they're going to be in the reports that are used by advertisers to determine the value that you get from radio station advertising. Now Pandora will be in that mix as well. We're actually quite optimistic about their future. So really, if this was an issue of their survival, it would be a very different issue. We think that they're trying to position themselves more for a negotiation than for actual legislation. Other question? Jerry.
I have three questions that I would invite you to comment. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure I'll learn a lot from you. You cited Walpole. Walpole has demonstrated that there's more music available now than ever before. I just wonder if you would comment on how that could happen in the face of all these problems. The second point, I don't know whether you're familiar, but a young scholar at Rutgers, Michael Carrier, it may not be out, has written an article that I peer reviewed, in which he interviewed an infinite number of very high-placed executives in the music industry, all of whom are anonymous in the findings. And he found all sorts of people who said that the decline in the music industry was self-inflicted, that there were all kinds of proposals along the way to make the technology and the file sharing ethos turn to account for the industry very early on, and it could have avoided all this massive losses. Now, it is nice to see that there are finally some adults in charge, and it's clear that you are dealing, it seems to me, with a lot of the ideas that people had. But I do wonder if you would comment on the lost opportunities. And finally, one that I think will interest you. You know that a number of academics are calling for disintermediation to get rid of you guys because it would put more music on the market. I just peer-reviewed an article and basing it on the fact that the artists would go to the YouTubes of the world and so on. So I just peer-reviewed an article. I don't even know who it's by. I think you'll be happy to say it takes the opposite view, a very strongly reasoned economic argument with data, that artists would actually suffer because they would not get any mentoring and any support, any nurturing on those sites, and would end up as losers. But one thought, and I thought it was, I recommended publication of it, and I think you'll find it interesting. But I do wonder this. You point out that only 2% of these artists that you're handling are actually selling. And I think, based on my own experience in the music industry, is that is partly due to insufficient nurturing. So I'm wondering what you're going to do, if you have any plans, apart from defending the internet, to actually increase support for young artists to break through this 2% blockbuster barrier.
Okay, now I know that I'm in an academic environment. Those were very academic questions. I expect no less. In terms of more music is available than ever before, Why would that be, given everything we've talked about? Because people can create music themselves now. Everybody is an artist now. Before, occasionally we would get to listen to demos that would come in for wannabes, and you really couldn't believe how bad some of them were. I mean, it was remarkable how somebody who couldn't even sing at all would think that they could have a career as a recording artist. Well, you know, those things just wound up in the trash, but now they wind up online too. So you have an enormous amount of music, some of which is by very, very talented people, but they can create extraordinarily great quality music on their own and try to make it on their own. That is why there is an outpouring of creative product. That is a great thing. And by the way, record labels scour the internet for that new talent. Some of our best signings have been from people who were heard on the internet. The question is not whether it can be produced, it's a question of whether it can find a mass market audience without the help of a label. In terms of the self-inflicted wounds and so on and so forth, am I correct that the Cary study was funded by Google? Yes. So there's a little bit of bias that's built into that to begin with, because let's face it, Google makes more money when copyright is not an impediment. There will. I haven't read the study myself, but I think we're publishing a response to it. Is that right? That will be coming out in a law journal in a few months or something like that. So I'd probably just refer you to that rather than try to get into the details. In terms of disintermediation, I didn't say that only 2% of artists are making it. I was simply pointing out that the behavior that we expected from the internet has not really come to pass. We expected a much more level music industry where niche artists would have so much opportunity that major artists would come down and niche artists would come up, and it would be more even. And it hasn't worked that way at all. It continues to be like this. The long tail is, very few people are buying stuff from the outer elements of the long tail. Most of them are buying the popular stuff. In other words, the trends in popular culture and behavior in popular culture hasn't really changed. Having said that, there will be more artists producing more material that finds more of an audience that will be available not only through major and indie labels, but through the internet without the help of those intermediaries. So we're going to see a flatter industry. It just isn't nearly as flat as we all expected it to be when we were buying the suppositions about behavior in a long-tail internet society. Artie? Yes. Yes, Artie.
So I will drag you from academia into the realpolitik of Washington, D.C. I don't know if that's a comfortable thing or not, but so I'm interested in the political economy of these issues because when I was in Washington now a few years ago, it struck me that the information technology industries, particularly Google, were not really players in the copyright space, and now it looks like they are. And what is your perspective on whether, for example, the reaction to SOPA was a Netroots phenomenon versus a carefully orchestrated kind of campaign by Google and company? And my guess, just to give you my priors, would be that you know, Netroots rarely have any impact, and so there must have been some careful orchestration. But I would like your perspective as well.
The tech community is deeply involved in copyright issues now. Google is deeply involved in copyright issues now. They fund a great deal of the trade associations that are on the other side of copyright, the think tanks, the academic research, they're everywhere. They really are. And that's their right to be. I mean, that's fine. And the motivation, I believe, is a business concern about copyright. That, you know, especially when you look at the ambiguity of copyright, the fact that in an internet world, everything is a reproduction, a distribution, a performance. Every time you do anything online, copyright can be a problem for them, and they want to minimize it if they can. So it's fine for them to be raising public policy issues, and it's fine for the industries affected by copyright to push back and try to find what they regard as more balance. So we're in a new world, there's no question about it. Copyright legislation in the past was there are good guys and there are bad guys. There are the good guys who are the creators, and the bad guys are the pirates, and you impose sanctions on the pirates and you do what you can to enforce. It's no longer like that. Copyright legislation is highly contentious, highly political, and very, very difficult to get passed. And I assure you there won't be any copyright legislation that gets passed that doesn't meet the test of every stakeholder that could possibly have an interest in it. That's just the new world we live in. The SOPA experience is really an example of that. SOPA was, you know, the target of SOPA was foreign rogue websites. These were, you know, the mega uploads of the world or the Pirate Bays of the world whose business was predicated on infringement, not just of copyrighted stuff, but of trademarked goods, so that they were selling counterfeit products, websites made to look like the original website of the actual producer of the product, whether it's Johnson & Johnson or, battery manufacturers, selling counterfeit products that actually endangered American consumers. And the risk to them, the notion that we would stop that stuff at the border when counterfeit merchandise was coming in, but it could freely come in if you bought it online. That's what the target of it was. It's not a surprise, therefore, that you had 41 sponsors in the Senate for this legislation, bipartisan. And you know how unusual it is to have bipartisan support for anything these days? So it was, a worthy objective with a worthy target, a target that needed attention and still needs attention. The problem is that there simply wasn't enough communication between the content side and the tech side. We were doing this the way legislation has always been done, where basically the stuff gets pushed through and all the issues get worked out. This legislation would not have, even with the 40 co-sponsors and everything, Google and all the other tech companies that were concerned about it would have had an opportunity for a forced negotiation to fix the problems. DNS blocking was going to come out. All sorts of things would have happened in the normal course to fix it. But instead of that usual process by which the legislation gets improved at the end, and that's been the history of all copyright legislation and most legislation generally, this became a public campaign where there was a netroots activism, in part, I think, because there was an opportunity to oppose something that people genuinely thought could involve censorship or something like that. I obviously didn't see it as censorship to say that you shouldn't be able to access a website that's selling counterfeit pharmaceuticals. But depending on your point of view, one can. And the truth is that you look at this legislation, we look at this legislation, we said this is an impossibly high standard. It won't be of any use to us as record companies. We thought we might be able to close down Pirate Bay. That was about it. That was the only website we could think of that met such the high standard in that legislation that we could go into court on an expedited basis and get a decision that Pirate Bay met that high standard. But then you have lawyers from Silicon Valley who are looking at the same test, and they're not thinking about Pirate Bay. They're thinking about how can some copyright owner use this against them in some way that they don't foresee. And they worry about it. That's perfectly reasonable. It is okay to look through a different prism and figure out this could be a problem for us, and therefore we need to fix it. We need more communication. We need to talk with each other. That's the reason that we're engaging in these conversations, because if we had a little bit more of a shared perspective, we would have a better chance of arriving at shared results that both sides can support. That's what we need for the future.
Cary, as you know, all glory is fleeting.